Okay, so let's go back to the complexity problem. See, I actually think it's in some sense, it's the fundamental problem. When you read about the terror management theorist types, they think that death is the fundamental problem. And that's a good argument, because it's definitely a fundamental problem, but I think it's a subset of the complexity problem. And the reason I think that is because sometimes people's lives become so complex that they'd rather be dead. So, and the reason they seek death through suicide is to make the complexity go away, because complexity causes suffering if it's uncontrolled. You know, things just get beyond your control. And that can happen, you know, if you're hit by 3 or 4 catastrophes at the same time. You know, maybe you have, oh, the political system collapses, there's hyperinflation, you lose your job, and you have someone that you love or 2 people die, and maybe you get cancer, something like that. Like that, those things happen to people, and they just think, well, there's no getting out of this, like it's just too much. And you know, one of the things that's very interesting about being a psychologist is that what you learn if you're going to be a psychologist is that people come to you with mental illnesses, and that's almost never true. People come to you because their lives are so damn complicated they cannot stay on top of them in any way that doesn't make it look like they're just going to get more complicated. And so then that causes symptoms. You know, it's like, it's this old idea, it's sort of a metaphor for genetic susceptibility. Take a balloon and blow it up until it's beyond its tolerance, it's going to blow out at the weakest point. Well, that's sort of what a genetic susceptibility is. If I just keep adding complexity on top of you, at some point you'll blow out at your weakest point. You know, maybe you'll get physiologically ill, maybe you'll start drinking, maybe you'll develop an anxiety disorder, maybe you'll get OCD, maybe you'll get depressed, whatever. There'll be something about you that's the weakest point, and if I just push, that's where you'll blow out. So that's a mental illness, but those things almost never just happen. Sometimes, but not very often. Usually people have just been hammered like 2 or 3 different ways, and then they collapse in the direction of their biological weakness, and then maybe you put them back together, but it's almost always a complexity related phenomena rather than a mental illness related phenomena. Not always, but almost always. Well, let's talk about friendships for a minute. Here's how you know if someone's your friend. A, you can tell them bad news and they'll listen. They won't tell you why, you know, you're stupid and why that bad thing happened to you and how something worse happened to them once and, you know, derail the whole conversation. You can actually tell them bad news and they'll listen. So that's a good thing. And then this is a weirder thing. You can tell them good news and they'll help you celebrate. And that's a really good way of deciding who you should have around you, because if you have someone around you, you know, something good happens to you and you're kind of afraid to even admit it because, you know, God, something good happened to you, it's like you let that be known and it'll certainly be taken away. So, you know, you come out and you sort of tell someone half-heartedly that something good happened to you, and they give you a whack and then talk about, you know, the great thing that happened to them 3 years ago, or worse, the great thing that happened to someone that they knew 3 years ago. You know, it's like, go away from that person. They're not helpful to you, and they're not helpful to themselves either. And so you want to surround yourself, you got to think about this. You got to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best part of you. You can hang around with weasels and losers that are trying to pull you down to justify the fact that they're spiraling downhill as well. And you know, the upside of that is you don't have to have any responsibility, and you can all whine about how wretched life is, you know, so that's pretty attractive. But I would say it's also a bad medium to long-term plan. And so it's acceptable and desirable to try to surround yourself with people who are facilitating your development. You know, and you might say, well, I've got people around, I know them well, you know, they're not doing that well, and they don't fit into that category. It's like, what's your point? What are you going to do with them exactly? If they'll listen and cooperate with you and move towards a better future, great. If they don't pay any attention and they keep doing the same damn things over and over and they're not going anywhere and it's painful, then maybe the proper thing to do is say, you just have your misery. I'll go off and have my life. And maybe you'll wake up at some point in the future and think that's a better way of being. Because just putting up with it is, well, they call that enabling, right? You put up with that sort of behavior, you're providing tacit consent for it and even tacit approval. It's like, it's a bad idea. You have, I would say, both the right and the responsibility to surround yourself with people who are good for the best part of you. I was reading this book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by a bunch of engineers at Google, and they were looking at billions of Google searches. And you know, there's no shortage of pornography on the internet, and there's much less by proportion than there was when the internet was first invented. And it's so interesting because it actually turned out that one of the things that drove the development of the internet and the technology was the proclivity of young men to search out sexually provocative images. That was what was at the forefront of the development of the net. It's extraordinarily interesting. They were motivated to use it for that purpose, and that provided the platform from which it emerged. Amazing. Anyways, the Google engineers looked at pornographic search processes and then segregated male searches from female searches, and what they found was that the males searched out images. Surprise, surprise, no one considers that, you know, particularly interesting, but the females searched out literary representations of pornography. It was written. And so I can give you an example of that. If you know about Harlequin romances, does everybody still know about those? Anybody not know about those? Okay, well, they're mass market romances, and of a very stereotypical type. And the original ones were pretty harmless in terms of no violence and no real sexual content. But that was 40 years ago, and they've differentiated tremendously, and now there's hardcore Harlequin romances, and with particularly garish covers, and then there's the old, you know, more tame, basic, sexless and aggressionless romances where everything is implied and not explicit, but the explicit ones exist. So they did a plot analysis of the typical pornographic female fantasy. Well, and it's so comical because engineers did this, and social scientists would never do this because they'd be probably too concerned about the ethics of it or some damn thing. But engineers, you know, they'll just plow ahead with no concern whatsoever for such things, and they actually discover things that way. And so they discovered the basic plot of the female pornographic literary product. And they identified, so basically what happened was that a innocent, well-meaning, and attractive young woman encounters a male who's a bit of a monster. And the monster, there's 5 types of classic male monster. For all you males who want to know, this is what you can become. Vampire, that's a good one. Werewolf, billionaire, pirate, and surgeon. Okay, so that's very interesting because, well, first of all, there's a dominance thing. Now you're actually blushing, you know, you're actually blushing about that. That's very, very funny. So, sorry to point it out, but it's so comical, you know. I know, it's so funny. I was reading this, it was just cracking me up. I thought, oh my God, really? Pirate, vampire, oh, that explains it. What about all these damn vampire shows, right? They're so popular online, they're so popular on Netflix. Oh yes, and then there's the werewolf. There's nothing sexier than a werewolf, apparently. But I mean, so there's predatory dominance that's implicit in that, right? With the billionaire, it's more abstract, but clearly that's an indication of very high success in the male dominance hierarchy. So, but there's this desire for aggression that's in that, a real aggression. Right, and it's not surprising to me at all. It makes perfect sense. But the basic plot is that the woman encounters this mysterious and aggressive male and tames him. That's the female hero myth, as far as I can tell. It's Beauty and the Beast. And so it's because, well, there's no fun in taming someone who's already tame. And what makes you think you really want someone who's tame anyways? There's no interest in that. Plus, when chaos manifests itself, what makes you think that someone tame is going to be good for anything? And it's a real question. And so that aggression is absolutely vital. It's absolutely necessary. But because it's incredibly dangerous, which of course it is, it has to be civilized. And so what happens is that the archetypal female in these pornographic romances seduces and tames the aggressive male. And that's her encounter with chaos. Now it's more complicated. Of course, females, they're more complicated, and that's exactly how it is. And it's no wonder, because their lives are more complicated. To be good, truly good, you can't just follow rules. That's very clear in the Harry Potter story. And you also have to be able to understand malevolence And in order to understand malevolence so that you can withstand it, you have to understand that part of you that's malevolent. Because if you don't, you're naive. And if you're naive, you're easy pickings. And so that's a Jungian idea too. And the Jungian idea is that part of personality development is to understand your shadow. And the shadow is those things about you that you do not want to admit to. And you can learn about your shadow by reading history. You know, you can read about Auschwitz. You can read about the concentration camps in Russia. And you can imagine yourself as a guard instead of as a heroic rescuer of unfortunate victims, which would be very, very unlikely. And once you can imagine yourself as a guard, which is a terrifying thing to do, then you understand something about yourself. And I actually think, and I think this is also from studying Jung, that you cannot have proper respect for yourself until you know that you're a monster, because you won't act carefully enough. You know, if you think, well, I'm a nice person, I'd never do anyone any harm, it's like, you're no saint. You can be sure of that. And the harm that you do people can come in many, many ways. And so, if you regard yourself as harmless, inoffensive, nice, well, why do you have any reason to be careful? You're like a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. Even if you throw it at someone, no one's going to get hurt. But that isn't what you're like, because you're a human being, and human beings are some vicious creatures. The problem with the hedonic route is that, so the pursuit of pure happiness, let's say, is that what makes you happy in the next minute might not be something that will make you happy in the next hour. Well, you know that. There's this comic, what's his name? They called him King of the One-Liners. He talked about drinking wine. He said, don't you know that's going to cause a hangover? And he said, yeah, at the end, but the beginning and middle are excellent. And so that's really the problem with hedonism, right, is that to pursue something that makes you happy in the immediate present risks sacrificing your, well, many things, but at least, let's say, your hedonism in the medium to long term. And of course, that is one of the major problems with drug use. And alcohol is a really good example of that, because whatever hedonic kick you might get from it that moment at night, you're going to pay for almost completely, or maybe even more so, because the next day you're much more jittery and anxious. And that's a direct consequence of withdrawing from the drug. So when you have a hangover, you're in alcohol withdrawal. So that's how fast you get, roughly speaking, addicted to it. And so if you take another drink when you're hungover, it'll cure it. But it's not a very useful cure, because all you do is push the inevitable hangover one more step into the future. And so part of the problem with the hedonic answer is happy when? Exactly, and over what period of time? And also, who's happy? Because maybe something makes you happy but makes your family miserable. Now you could say, well, I don't care, but you do care if you have to live with your family, because they're going to take it out on you. So the impulsive hedonism, which is also fostered, say, by a positive emotion, it tends to put people into a state of the pursuit of short-term hedonism. It's not a good long-term or medium to long-term solution. I actually think that's why people evolved conscientiousness, right? Because conscientiousness is not happy. Conscientious people aren't conscientious because it makes them happy. We're starting to think that they're conscientious because they actually feel terrible if they're just sitting around doing nothing. And so it's a way of staving off stress, the stress that's related to enforced leisure, something like that. You know, if you know industrious people, some of you are industrious, some of you will have industrious parents. They just can't sit around and do nothing. They have to be working. They don't feel good unless they're working. So one thing about conscientiousness is that it involves continual sacrifice, right? You're doing difficult things in the present, hypothetically, to make the future better. But that's not driven by hedonism by any stretch of the imagination. And conscientiousness is actually a pretty good predictor of long-term life success in stable societies. Because there's also no point in being conscientious and saving things up and storing things if a bunch of thugs are going to just come in randomly and take it all away. So conscientiousness actually only works intelligently in societies that have some medium to long-term stability. You know, because you can get wiped out by hyperinflation too, because hyperinflation kills off the conscientious people. The people who accrue debts are thrilled when hyperinflation kicks in because it wipes out their debts, but Of course, those debts are the things they owe to people who were conscientious enough to save.